Hello, I'm Jonathan Delbridge and I'd like to welcome you to my piano teaching studio based in Crewkerne in South Somerset, where I run a business, JD Music Services, and as well as offering piano tuition, we also offer various other services, organising music for concerts, arranging music, all sorts of things. Check out our website jdmusicservices.co.uk for more information. For those living further afield, we can also offer piano lessons with myself via Skype. But what I would like to do today is have a little look at Mozart's Piano Sonata in C, K545. It's often the first piano sonata by Mozart that pianists will look at. And over a series of videos, I want to look at this particular sonata, look at the first movement, and hopefully give you some suggestions and helps for learning it. We'll look at some of the technical difficulties that you might come up against, techniques to overcome those, and we'll also look at the musical aspects of the piece, how we should express it, the articulation, and all those different aspects as well. It's a good sonata to learn, and I would say if you're round about grade 6 standard, following the exam syllabus, then this is a good sonata to look at, and you could probably learn the whole sonata. The second movement is technically the easiest, although there's a lot involved with expression. And the third movement is probably technically the most challenging. First movement is maybe slightly easier than the last movement. So today we're going to take an overview of the sonata, and perhaps over the next week, before I do the next video, you can start to take an overview of the whole sonata, get an idea of the whole work. Firstly, I want to talk about your edition that you use. It's an excellent idea to get an urtext edition. An urtext is a copy of the original print, basically. They haven't added in lots of extra dynamics and all sorts of things like that. And it's interesting that in this particular sonata, there are no dynamic markings by Mozart, and we'll talk more about that later on. There are quite a few marks to indicate the articulation, and again we'll talk about that in later sessions. So try to get an urtext edition. We then come on to the issue of fingering, and personally I like an edition that doesn't have any fingering written in, so then I can work out the fingering that suits me best and pencil that in myself. Some editions do have useful fingering in there, and that can be useful, so I'll leave that up to you, but my personal preference is to go for an edition with no fingering. As we go through the sessions, I may suggest fingering for different sections, but it's important you find what is comfortable for your hand, and it may not always be quite the same as I suggest, and we'll talk about that later. So get yourself an urtext edition before you start to look at this work. And also, I think it's important to have one where it's relatively easy to read. So my particular copy here is spread over 2, 4, 5 pages, which means that the print is quite easy for me to read, and the page turns are in sensible places, so I can even manage those without necessarily having a page turner. So that's a little bit about the edition. The next thing I would aim to do is to sight read through the whole work once, so that I get a good overview of the whole work. We're not necessarily worried at this stage about getting all the technical details right, that will come later, but we're getting an overview of the whole work. Now it's important that we only sight read it once, maybe twice, but not too many times, because otherwise we may start to learn wrong, incorrect fingerings, or fingerings that don't fit nicely under the hand. So it's important we don't sight read it too much, but once or twice to start off with, I think is a good idea to get an overview of the work. Of course, you could also listen to recordings, and there are advantages and disadvantages to this. The advantage is it, again, gets you an overview of the whole piece. The disadvantage is that might bias you a little bit in how you interpret music. So my suggestion is, if you listen to recordings, listen to lots of different ones. Don't just listen to one recording. And of course YouTube is a fantastic resource for that. You don't necessarily have to go out and buy lots and lots of CDs. You can find lots of recordings on YouTube. The next thing I would aim to do at this stage is get an idea of the overall structure of the piece, and that's what I want to talk about a bit today. This first movement follows the usual structure of sonata form. So we have an exposition at the beginning, where we expose two themes. Here's the first theme, which we get at the opening. And so on. That's the opening first theme in C major. When we get to bar 13 and 14, we get the second theme in the exposition. And so on. The second theme is, as usual, in the dominant key, the key of G major. So we start in C major, and the second subject, 5 notes up, G major, the dominant. It's quite interesting that the tune is kind of an inversion of the first tune. Just notice. So those first 3 notes were the notes of the triad going up, C, E, G. In the second subject, we get the triad for G major, but going down. D, B, G. So it's interesting that there's kind of that link between the two themes. Then, when we move on to bar 29, we get the development section. And so on. And at this point, Mozart kind of moves away from some of the material from the first or second subject, although we do have scales, which perhaps relate back to in the first subject, and we also have arpeggio patterns, which perhaps relate back to, or maybe in the second subject, where we've got this idea, all based around arpeggio patterns. So there are links between the development and the first and second subjects, and in the development Mozart explores a range of keys before taking us to the recapitulation, where we encounter the first and second subjects again. Now, unusually, in this situation, the first subject appears in the key of F major, which is the subdominant key. And so on. That's unusual because normally the first subject would come back in the tonic. When we get to the second subject, at that point Mozart moves us back to the tonic. And so on. And that brings the whole of the first movement to a close. I feel it's important to be familiar with the structure of the classical sonata. In the classical period, structure and form was very important. As we move later into the Romantic period of music, music began to be inspired by nature, by the spiritual, by patriotism and various other things. But in the classical period that this is written in, structure and form are very important. So I think it's a good idea to get an overview of the structure of the music as you begin to look at this piece. What that also means is when you actually start to learn the piece, you can break it into sections. So we might, for example, learn the first subject, so learn from the beginning to bar 12. Then we may tackle the second subject from bar 13 to bar 28, and so on. However, there is something, I think, to be said with sonatas with perhaps looking at some of the development first. And I say that because it's often the development that is technically more difficult, more challenging than the rest of the piece. I guess it depends, it's up to you really. Some people prefer to look at the difficult sections first. Other people might prefer to start with the first subject to get a familiarity with the main tune. So I hope that's been useful. Feel free to add comments and give me your thoughts and ideas. Next session, we'll probably start to look in more detail at the first subject, and we'll look at some of the musical details, and we'll also look at some of the technical challenges. So I'll look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, do check out jdmusicservices.co.uk, and if you're interested in piano lessons, of course, in South Somerset, or interested in Skype lessons, do get in touch with me through the website. Thank you.